Originally designed in response for a requirement of a light observation helicopter by the United States Army, the Hughes 500D was a civilianised version which was first released to the civilian market in 1976. Since then it has been operated by various individuals under private ownership, companies as executive transport, and law enforcement services. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and welcome to the first part of my Academy Hughes 500D helicopter kit build, where I focus on the police motorcycle and rider. I had planned on doing this all as one video, but during construction it turned out that this model would warrant its own episode. So join me on the workbench as I build and review the police motorcycle and rider in 1/48 scale from the Academy Hughes 500D model kit. For a more detailed look at the contents of the kit, take a look at the unboxing video I previously made on that subject, where I focus on the quality of the sprues, instructions and included decals. For this video though, I'll be focusing on the build and seeing what it's like when it's finished. I'll pop a list of products I used during this particular stage of the build to give you an idea of the things you might need to get if you have one of these yourself. As a reminder though, Academy does recommend this kit to those aged 14 and older. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. I began by snipping the various parts from their sprues. I used my side cutters to do this. Then carefully sand down the rough areas and any flash with a sanding stick. There were some mould lines and bits of flash on the figure, so I carefully scraped them away with my knife. I would also clean up some of the other parts off camera before assembling them too. I chose to use Revell contactor cement for this part of the build, carefully applying cement to the underside of the bike. The applicator needle on this particular glue makes this quite easy to do. I glued the engine exhaust pipes into place here. This was then followed by cementing the other half of the engine into place on the frame. Next, the rear light and license plate were glued to the back of the bike. I then tried to glue the panniers to the side of the bike, but realised I had to remove the previously installed light component as it was just in the way. With that done, I managed to get the panniers to fit and then replace the light and license plate. The storage box on the rear of the bike can now be glued on as well. This triangular part is cemented onto the frames here, which is then followed by the seat for the rider. It simply cements onto a locating lug. The fuel tank can be cemented into its position on the front of the frame here. This was then followed by the pipework at the front of the bike. The front wheel had the handlebar glued into place, but I won't add this to the rest of the bike just yet. The rider is missing an arm, so let's fix that by gluing it on. This can be positioned at slightly different angles, but I tried to get it so that it would look like, at the very least, he was holding the handlebars of the bike. A clear part is included for the front windscreen part, and my first step here was to mask that area that should remain clear with some tape. Initially I'm using this flexible masking tape so that it will follow the curve of the frame, but after that I used some normal tape to cover the rest of the windscreen. Now, with those sub-assemblies done, let's get some paint on the model. I started off with this Vallejo Model Air White, which I sprayed onto all these parts. Whilst the plastic is moulded in white, it does seem quite bright with a slightly blue hue to it. This matte white should bring down the shine and make it a little more subdued. When that was dry, Vallejo Matte Black was thinned with a drop of Tamiya acrylic thinner and then carefully brushed onto the tyres of the wheels. This is quite a fiddly job, so I'm using a thin brush here. This was quite a time-consuming step, and I needed a lot of patience. It was at this point that I realised this particular part of the model kit was not going to be as simple and easy as I'd first thought. Having previously glued all these parts onto the back of the bike made painting the rear wheel a proper challenge. In hindsight, it would have been easier to paint the wheels before assembly. After some considerable time, I moved on to use this Vallejo gunmetal grey, which was carefully painted onto the suspension of the front wheel. I'd also apply this paint to the engine as well. Vallejo aluminium was then brushed onto the engine exhaust pipes, taking care to avoid any areas it shouldn't be in. I also brushed it onto the metal strip just under the windscreen. With that done, Vallejo IDF blue was carefully applied to the central light on the front part of the model. Tamiya XF7 flat red was then brushed onto the smaller lights either side of the central one. Now it's time to get some decals on. I've cut the ones for the bike from the larger sheet, and as you can see, the printing isn't the best. They were soaked in warm water and then left to release from the paper. Having had bad experiences with Academy decals in the past, I chose to use Humbrol Decal Fix, as it is a bit more aggressive than my normal decal setting solutions and should help make these thick and papery decals conform to the surface of the model. I started off with the black circles for the dials on the handles, but they were a bit of a joke and there was no way they were going to fit on with all that excess film. I thought it would just be easier to bin these and paint the dials on instead. I'm not sure what this decal is supposed to represent, but I put it in place on the front part of the bike. The decal film is too big on these triangle ones, so I carefully trimmed it off using my scissors. I should have done this before removing them from the paper to make it a bit easier though. It could then be popped into place on the side of the bike. I did apply the rest of the decals off camera as it became a bit time consuming having to tidy them up then carefully stick them on one by one. With them all finally in place though, a small amount of Humbrol polycement was used to glue the front wheel onto the rest of the frame. This cement is thicker than the Revell cement used previously and should give some time for adjusting the fit of the part. With that done, I mixed up some Vallejo gloss and matte varnishes in equal parts to give a more satin finish. This was thinned with some water and then sprayed onto the model to create a protective layer for the decals. When the varnish was dry, the masking on the windscreen could be carefully removed. It was then carefully cemented into place on its mounting points on the front wheel of the bike. Here I've got some stretched sprue, which I'm going to use to represent the aerial for the radio. I cut a length of it, then glued it into the little hole on the back of the bike. It was still a little tall, so I simply snipped away the excess. The Vallejo aluminium paint then made a reappearance and was applied to the radio wire to make it look a little more realistic. The bike is pretty much done now, so I now need to focus my attention on painting the rider. First up is this Vallejo medium flesh tone, which was painted onto his face and bare arms. It's a bit yellow, but I will address that later. Vallejo khaki was then brushed onto his trousers. A couple of layers would be needed to cover up the white undercoat. The IDF blue makes a comeback as it was used on his shirt, taking care to avoid the flesh and trousers previously painted. This tan earth paint was used to highlight his hair and also the baton attached to his belt. I then gave his riding gloves a coat of this paint as well. I used some black paint to paint his holster, pouches and the entire belt around his waist. I'd also used this on part of his helmet and glasses. Humbrol matte blue acrylic number 25 was used on the remainder of his helmet, carefully avoiding the black I'd already applied. Vallejo gold was used on the rear of his helmet, with a few layers being needed to cover up the blue. I also added some to his badge on his chest. There are some decals for the patches on his arms, which were applied in the same way as before. A quick coat of matte varnish was brushed onto the figure to give a bit more of a uniform finish and protect those decals. I did try and avoid the blue and gold on the helmet though, as I thought they should look a little bit shinier. The gloss varnish was then added to the helmet to make sure that it was indeed shiny. Humbrol 79 blue-grey enamel paint was then properly mixed and thinned with white spirit to make an enamel wash. It was then brushed onto the model and allowed to seep into the recessed details to add shadow and an element of grime. The figure also received a thin layer of this wash to try and add some shadow into the recessed areas of the moulding. When that was done, Vallejo Pale Sand was dry brushed onto the figure to bring out the raised details. I did try to work from higher areas to lower ones to give an impression of shadows lower down on the figure. It also helped to make the flesh look less like a character from The Simpsons and more like an actual person. With that done, some paint was scraped from the seat of the bike and the figure was glued into place. The bike is supposed to stand up now that the figure has been added, but either I've done something wrong or it's a bit optimistic of the instructions. It just kept falling over, or if it did stand up, it was leaning far too much to make it look realistic. To fix this, I added the kickstand, which comes included in the kit. Apparently, you're only supposed to use this if the rider is not on the bike, but I just didn't see it standing up properly without it. It was glued into place and then given a coat of Vallejo aluminium to make it look a little more realistic. And with that, my build of the motorcycle and rider, as included in the Academy Hughes 500D helicopter kit, is now complete. So, what did I think of this particular part of the build? Well, I thought initially that it would be quite a simple step and wouldn't take much time to complete at all. However, after working on this for more or less a whole day, it seems I grossly underestimated it. By this point, I haven't even started on the helicopter yet. Generally, the parts are to a reasonably good quality, but there is some flash and the detail isn't exactly mind-blowing. It's not bad though, given the age of the kit, which I will go into more depth on in part 2 of this build. The decals were pretty horrendous, being thick, papery, having loads of extra film, and generally quite poorly printed. After copious amounts of decal fix, they did eventually stick to the surface of the model, but they did need considerably more than other decals from other manufacturers. The instructions were generally okay to follow, but did need to be thoroughly read in order to make sure I was adding the right parts and paints. Whilst I did try to follow the painting instructions in the kit, and used some pictures online as references, I feel that I did go a little rogue with my colour choices for the figure. Some of them might not be particularly accurate to a real life example, but I think it looks okay. On the flip side though, it has given me a bit more experience of painting figures in slightly larger scales, which I think will be beneficial in the future for some other projects I've got planned. I'm fortunate that I had enough choice of paints during this build too, and that's thanks to my patrons and channel members. A massive thanks to these guys on screen. Check out the links in the description below to find out more and how you can get involved. But anyways, I think it's time to wrap this first video in this mini-series up. Whilst this hasn't been the most painless build in the world, and I half expected it to only be a side note and not an entire video in its own right, I'm actually quite pleased with the results, especially as it's a little out of my comfort zone from my normal builds. But let's just generally say that the areas that I found to be a little troublesome in this part are going to be a bit of a common theme in the second part as well. Make sure you are subscribed and have hit that notification bell so that you don't miss when the next part is released, and I'll be focusing on the construction of the rest of the helicopter and completing my review. Don't forget to leave a comment under the video letting me know what you think of my build and any tips or suggestions for future uploads. If you enjoyed this one, a click of that like button will help please the algorithmic overlords of YouTube. Finally, a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I will see you on the workbench again next time.